Intellectuals and Race, quote, "The era of multiculturalism might be considered an extension of the liberal era, but it has evolved its own characteristics. Multiculturalism is an insistence that the particular cultures found among less fortunate groups are not to be blamed for disparities in income or education or crime rates, but are on net positive."
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that.
You can't find any fault with any group that is less fortunate. There are no behaviors that they need to change in order to advance. Society needs to accept them as they are. In other words, the causes are to remain the same, but the effects are to change. And if the effects don't change, then it's society's fault.
So, for example, there was a period, I'm trying to remember now, I believe it was in the mid-'70s, when substandard English began to become viewed as a discipline of its own within linguistic studies and so forth. And for all I know, it was all perfectly legitimate that certain speech patterns would be traced back to various regions in Africa and so forth. And this is a language of its own. It has its own validity. But your argument would be, I don't really care what its validity is. It's holding people back. It's preventing them from participating in the wider society. Is that right?
Absolutely. And also, none of these things went back to Africa.
Oh, is that so?
No. Yes, they did not go back to Africa. If you look at the peach, for example, using the word axe for ask and stuff like that, all of that goes back to the South. And it goes back to the parts of Britain from which white Southerners came. So if you trace calling hog entrails chitlins, that was in a certain section of Britain, the section from which whites moved into the South, and they were known as rednecks and crackers in Britain in centuries past before they ever set foot in the South. So the whole thing is as phony as the $3 bill.
Once again, intellectuals and race. The key word among advocates of multiculturalism became diversity.
Yes.
Sweeping claims for the benefits of demographic and cultural diversity have prevailed without a speck of evidence being asked for or given. Name a few institutions in which diversity is championed without evidence.
Gosh, the question would be, name one way where that isn't the case. I would say the whole Ivy League, Stanford, Berkeley.
Corporate America?
Yes. It's really miraculous almost. I mean, I can't think of a word that has gained such widespread use and which is utterly unchallenged without one speck of evidence. If you look at societies that are diverse, they have all they can do to avoid mutual bloodshed. I mean, India, for example, is very diverse, and you know
it barely coheres as a nation.
That's right. When India was given its freedom by Britain and split into India and Pakistan, I mean, the number of people slaughtered between Hindus and Muslims ran into the hundreds of thousands.
All right. So this brings us to affirmative action, of course. And let's take a look at the 2003 Supreme Court case, Grutter versus Bollinger, in which the Supreme Court upheld the affirmative action admissions policy of the University of Michigan Law School. Writing for the majority, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the Constitution, quote, does not prohibit the tailored use of race in admissions decisions to further a compelling interest in obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body, close quote. That's pretty high sounding. What's wrong with that?
It would have been nice if she could produce one speck of evidence for it.
Doesn't it feel intuitively correct, though?
No.
That you put students together with other students of different backgrounds?
Let's assume for the sake of argument that it is intuitively accepted. That doesn't relieve you from having to look at the evidence to find out if that's true. One of the things that when I was going around, when I was taking my kids around to pick colleges, I would go into the lunchroom at lunchtime and look around. And if I found that all the black kids were at one table and all the white kids were at a different table, I knew what the atmosphere was at that school. I went to school in the 50s. I never saw that. So that you say what the benefits are going to be, and then you come along and test it. You don't just say, that sounds so wonderful, and there's no need to go any further. And if you look at what has happened in these places, you find that the polarization is far greater after these policies are followed than there were before.
Intellectuals and Race, quote, a growing body of empirical data shows that black students mismatched with the colleges or universities they attend fail or drop out more often than other students. The problem is not that these black students are unqualified. The problem is that they are mismatched with the college or university that has admitted them for the sake of, quote, diversity. Yeah. Now, what do you mean by mismatched?
Well, I'll give a simple example. When I was teaching at Cornell back in the 60s, the average SAT score of black students at Cornell was at the 75th percentile. The average SAT for the white students in liberal arts was at the 99th percentile. We all taught to the students who were at the 99th percentile. Students who were at the 75th percentile had a hard time trying to keep up. They didn't have the reading speed, they didn't have the mathematical facility, and so on. Had these very same students gone to some place where the other students were at the 75th percentile, they'd have had no problem. Half the black students at Cornell at that time were on academic probation. It was even worse at MIT. The average black student, when this study was done some years ago at MIT, scored in the top 10% nationwide in math. They scored in the bottom 10% at MIT.
So the point is, there are a lot of very good schools in America where they could have gone and been right in the swim
Yes.
of elite institutions.
Yes.
Just not at MIT.
That's right.
All right. So we've established in Intellectuals and Race, the progressives are obviously culpable. They were racists. They were straightforward racists. Under Woodrow Wilson, you make the point, it was under Woodrow Wilson that certain agencies in the federal government first begin to enforce segregation.
Yes, in Washington.
So culpability on the part of the progressives. You've just told us that the liberals, by enunciating their views, insisting on them in public again and again and again, set up a kind of intellectual culture that made things worse,
Yes.
not better. Again, they're at fault. And now you're saying that multiculturalists, if only this example of bringing kids into institutions for which they're ill-qualified, you take bright, hardworking, otherwise perfectly well-qualified students and put them in the wrong institution, and you set them back in life.
Yes.
And they're culpable as well. They ought to know better.
Yes.
Intellectuals and Race, quote, the intelligentsia pay no price for being wrong.
I think that's the secret of their influence.
How's that?
If you come up with a lot of wrong ideas and pay a price for it, you're forced to think about it and to change your ways or else get eliminated. But there's no such test. The only test for most intellectuals is whether other intellectuals go along with them. And if they all have a wrong idea, then it becomes invincible.
Tom, you're coming pretty close to saying intellectuals aren't very smart.
They are very smart in very limited areas. And they don't realize that it's the limited areas. That's the problem. I mean, chess grandmasters are very smart. I mean, if you can stand there blindfolded and play 3 different players without looking at the board and beat them, you're pretty smart.
So your argument would be that at an elite institution, the folks in the physics department are really good physicists. Mm-hmm. And the folks in the English department know everything there is to know about Shakespeare and Milton. But there's no reason to suppose at all that they've done any work in or studied the evidence on affirmative action or any of the other policies by which they attempt to deal with racial problems in this country. And yet they all, somehow or other, believe the same things about it.
Yes.
Okay. This is all very disconcerting, Tom, you know. Cosmic justice, intellectuals and race, quote, no individual or group can be blamed for being born into circumstances that lack advantages. But neither can society be automatically assumed to be either the cause or the cure for such disparities. Yeah. Close quote. So what you're arguing is that despite centuries of, several centuries of slavery, I'm talking now about the African American experience in this country, slavery ends, you've got decades of Jim Crow, you've got policies that have created substandard conditions in one inner city in America after another to this day. Despite all of that, for the African American child born in inner city Detroit tomorrow, it just is what it is. It's nobody's fault that that child is likely to have worse life expectations than the white kid born tomorrow in Greenwich, Connecticut.
The ease with which people draw connections between one thing and another is just amazing. I mean, it's like I mean, the average of black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially, than say Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous
Black
surgeon at
neurosurgeon.
Johns Hopkins,
Right.
who is immensely accomplished in every way.
Yes.
Right.
I would say that certainly the black kids who are growing up today have a higher material standard of living than I had. The difference was that the schools were good when I came along. They were especially good in New York at that time, hard as that is to believe. But the kids who grew up in that same place where I lived, they will not get that same education. Now that can be blamed on somebody, but it has very little to do with what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's true in other countries. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's a tribe, the Igbos, who are living in one of the least fertile parts of Nigeria, who were in fact enslaved in centuries past by other tribes and so on. When the British moved in and set up schools, the Igbos went for the schools. By the time Nigeria became independent, the Igbos had climbed above the other groups that had been ahead of them to begin with. But there are all kinds of cross currents of factors. The particular culture, or the particular geography, you run through the whole list of them.
You cite, in Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations. Is this the...
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
Whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.